The Aurelia, perched 62 floors above the ceaseless pulse of Chicago, was less a restaurant and more a cathedral dedicated to the worship of wealth. Its silence was a calculated luxury, a soft hush where the clink of silver on porcelain was a form of punctuation, and multi-million-dollar deals were whispered into existence over plates of food that cost more than a month's rent in the Logan Square apartment Clara McCallum called home. For Clara, silence was different. It was not a luxury, it was the language of her birth. It was the expressive dance of her parents' hands across the dinner table, the vibrant, nuanced world of the deaf community that had raised her. At 23, she moved through Aurelia's opulent theater with a practiced serenity that concealed a bone-deep weariness. Her black uniform was a crisply starched suit of armor, hiding the frayed edges of her life, the stack of bills on her tiny kitchen counter, the constant low-grade hum of anxiety for her parents, whose fixed incomes were a constant source of struggle. Every exorbitant tip she earned from patrons who wouldn't think twice about a $1,000 bottle of wine went into a fiercely protected account, a buffer against the world's harsh uncertainties for the two people who had given her everything. Tonight, the restaurant's gravitational center had shifted. Alistair Finch was dining at table 12, the prime corner booth with a panoramic view of the glittering city bleeding into the black void of Lake Michigan. At 38, Finch was a titan of private equity, a man who didn't just acquire companies but consumed them, restructuring them with a brutal efficiency that had earned him a formidable reputation and a net worth with 10 zeros. He was a man chiseled from ice and ambition, with eyes the color of a winter sky that saw everything as an asset or a liability. He was rarely seen in public, and almost never with his daughter, but tonight was an exception. With him was his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, a fragile porcelain doll of a child, swallowed by the plush velvet of the booth. Her blonde hair was a perfect glossy sheet, her dress a confection of pale pink silk. A single delicate hearing aid, studded with a tiny diamond, was nestled behind her ear. A useless, expensive piece of technology, Alistair insisted she wear, more as a symbol of his efforts than for any practical function. Lily had been born profoundly deaf, and the world of sound was as alien to her as the surface of Mars. Beside her sat Garrison Thorne, Alistair's brother-in-law, a man whose smile was as polished and expensive as his Patek Philippe watch. He managed the considerable trust left to Lily by her late mother, and his presence was a constant, cloying fixture in their lives. The restaurant's general manager, Mr. Dubois, fluttered around the table, his anxiety a palpable aura. "Mr. Finch, your usual steak, medium rare?" he asked, his voice thick with sycophantic reverence. Alistair nodded, his attention fixed on a financial report on his tablet. "Yes, and for my daughter," his voice, usually a sharp instrument of command, faltered for a microsecond. "The chicken, no sauce, plain." Dubois turned his practiced, overly enthusiastic smile on the child. He leaned in close, raising his voice and over-enunciating his words as if speaking to a tourist. "And how are we tonight, little Miss Lily?" Lily didn't react. She didn't even flinch. Her gaze was locked on her own small hands, twisting a linen napkin into knots in her lap. A faint, hot blush crept up her neck, a telltale sign of shame that Clara, standing by her service station, recognized with a painful lurch of her heart. It was the sting of being treated like an imbecile, of being shouted at by a world that refused to learn her language. Alistair's jaw hardened into a line of granite. "She can't hear you, Dubois. It doesn't matter how loud you speak." The words were clipped, cold steel. He despised this part of their lives, the public spectacle of his daughter's deafness, the clumsy, well-meaning gestures that only served to highlight the chasm between Lily and the rest of the world. Since his wife, a celebrated concert violinist, had been killed in a car crash 4 years ago, their world had become a fortress of silence he didn't know how to breach. He could buy Lily the best audiologists, the most advanced cochlear implant technology, which she had rejected with violent terror, but he couldn't buy her a connection to the world or to him. Clara watched, a familiar ache tightening in her chest. She saw her own childhood in Lily's dignified retreat. She saw the countless times strangers had treated her deaf parents with that same infuriating mix of pity and condescension. She saw the slow, heartbreaking process of a bright spirit dimming behind a wall, not because they couldn't communicate, but because the hearing world was too lazy or too arrogant to meet them halfway. Dubois scurried away mortified. Garrison placed a hand on Lily's shoulder, a proprietary gesture. "She's just tired, Alistair. It's been a long day." Alistair ignored him, putting his tablet away. He leaned towards his daughter, catching her eye and beginning to move his lips in an exaggerated, unnatural way. "Eat your dinner." It was the clumsy, ineffective lip reading they defaulted to, a language that offered crumbs of communication where a feast was needed. The connection was strained, a frayed wire sparking with frustration. Clara felt an impulse, a reckless, powerful surge that defied every rule of her employment. Dubois' primary directive was an unspoken commandment. "You are furniture that moves. Do not engage unless engaged with." Especially not with Alistair Finch. But the image of Lily's small, knotted hands and the profound loneliness radiating from her small frame overrode years of professional conditioning. It was a career risk, but it felt like a human imperative. She drew a quiet, steadying breath, smoothed the front of her apron, and began to walk towards the most powerful table in Chicago. The very air around it seemed to crackle with pressure. Garrison Thorne looked up as she approached, his polished smile tightening with annoyance. Mr. Dubois, from across the dining room, froze mid-gesture, his face draining of color. Alistair Finch lifted his head, and his stormy, calculating eyes locked onto her. A silent question hung in the air, laced with the clear warning that this interruption had better be worth his time. "We don't require anything," he said, his voice a low, preemptive dismissal. Clara's heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs, but she didn't look at him. Her entire focus, her entire being, was aimed at the small, silent girl in the booth. She gave a small, respectful dip of her head towards Lily. Then she lifted her hands. With a fluid, breathtaking grace that was as natural to her as breathing, her hands began to move. They spoke a language of poetry and precision, of emotion and intellect. "Good evening," she signed, a soft, genuine smile gracing her lips. "My name is Clara. That is a very beautiful dress you are wearing. It looks like the color of a sunset over the lake." The world at table 12 didn't just stop, it shattered. Garrison Thorne stared, his mouth slightly agape, the mask of suave control slipping to reveal raw shock. Alistair Finch's face, a moment before a portrait of cold authority, was now a canvas of pure, unadulterated astonishment. He looked as though he'd been struck by lightning, but the most profound reaction came from Lily. Her eyes, which had been dull and downcast, snapped up to meet Clara's. They widened, first in disbelief, then in a dawning, radiant wonder. It was as if a light had been switched on in a dark room. Her small body, which had been curled inward with tension, straightened. The years of quiet resignation seemed to melt away from her tiny shoulders. Slowly, hesitantly, as if retrieving a long-forgotten skill from a dream, she raised her own hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, the movements clumsy from disuse, but the intent was clear. You know the words of my hands?" She signed back, her expression one of breathtaking, heart-stopping awe. In that single silent exchange, the quiet waitress had detonated a bomb in the billionaire's meticulously controlled world. Not with a shout, but with the profound, earth-shaking power of a conversation he could not hear. The air in Aurelia was thick and motionless. The quiet symphony of clinking forks and hushed conversations had faded into an irrelevant background hum. For a few stretched-out seconds, the universe seemed to pivot around the silent, eloquent ballet of hands at the corner table. Alistair Finch stared, his hyper-analytical mind failing to compute the scene before him. He had poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into the world's leading specialists, speech therapists, and a series of private tutors who had tried and failed to teach him the basics of American Sign Language. He had found it frustratingly abstract, a language his logical, numbers-oriented brain could not absorb. Yet here, in his regular haunt, A waitress in a standard-issue uniform was conversing with his daughter more fluently and with more genuine connection than he had managed in her entire life. Clara, acutely aware of the stunned silence from the two men, kept her focus locked on Lily. She felt a powerful, protective connection to the child, a shared citizenship in a silent country that transcended the vast canyon of their circumstances. "I do." Clara signed back, her movements fluid and warm. "It was my first language. My mother and father are deaf. They taught me before I could even speak." She tilted her head. "I bet you have a lot to say." A brilliant, tear-bright smile bloomed on Lily's face. It was a full, unreserved expression of joy, a sight so rare that Alistair felt a painful clench in his chest. His daughter's hands moved with more confidence now, a torrent of communication breaking through a 4-year dam. "My mommy taught me signs." Lily signed, her eyes shining. "We had secret names for the flowers in her garden. The roses were red kisses, the daisies were sun stars. But since she went to heaven, no one speaks my language anymore. Daddy tries, but his hands are too slow." She glanced at her father, a look of love mixed with a child's simple, honest assessment. Alistair watched the exchange, a storm of conflicting emotions churning inside him. Amazement, a deep, gnawing guilt, and a terrifying flicker of hope. He was seeing a ghost, not the ghost of his wife, but the ghost of his daughter. The bright, engaged child she had been when her mother was alive. The thick fog of sorrow and isolation that perpetually surrounded her was lifting, burned away by the warmth of this stranger's attention. He had been trying to fix her deafness, to fill the silence with technology and tutors, when all she had ever needed was to be heard. Clara responded to Lily with the gentle empathy of a native speaker. "Secret names are the best kind. I bet the garden misses your conversations." Before Lily could reply, Alistair finally found his voice, which came out as a rough, strangled sound. "How?" he asked, his tone stripped of its usual authority, leaving only raw, urgent curiosity. "Where did you learn that?" Clara finally turned her gaze to him. Her professional composure clicked back into place, a shield against the intensity of his stare, though her heart was still hammering. "My parents are deaf, sir. ASL is my native language." Mr. Dubois was now hovering nearby, wringing his hands, his face a mask of pure terror. He was convinced this bizarre breach of protocol was about to cost the restaurant its most valuable patron. He opened his mouth to apologize, to drag Clara away and fire her on the spot, but Alistair silenced him with a single, sharp look. "Don't," he commanded, his eyes never leaving Clara. He then turned to his brother-in-law. "Garrison, take the car. My meeting with the board is canceled tomorrow. In fact, clear my entire schedule." It was an unequivocal dismissal. Garrison, though visibly surprised and annoyed, rose with practiced smoothness. He gave Lily a perfunctory pat on the head and shot Clara a look that was both assessing and deeply resentful before departing. The table was now an island of intimacy in the crowded room, occupied only by a father, his daughter, and the waitress who had just become the most important person in their world. "Please," Alistair said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. He gestured to the empty chair Garrison had vacated. "Sit." "Sir, I can't. I'm on duty," Clara stammered, acutely aware of Dubois' panicked face in her peripheral vision. "No, you're not," Alistair stated, not as a request, but as a fact. "As of this second, your employment here is terminated. You now work for me." He looked past her to the terrified manager. "Dubois, a severance package for Ms. McCallum, 6 months' salary, and add a $5,000 tip to my bill for the inconvenience. She will be leaving with me." Dubois blinked, the sheer monetary force of the command short-circuiting his panic. He simply nodded, dumbstruck, and retreated. Overwhelmed and reeling, Clara slowly sank into the plush velvet chair. It felt like stepping through a looking glass into another dimension. Lily beamed at her, her entire small body radiating a happiness that was almost tangible. She reached across the table and tentatively touched Clara's hand. "Will you teach my daddy?" Lily signed, her expression alight with a hope so fierce it was heartbreaking. For the next hour, as the restaurant slowly emptied, a conversation unfolded. unlike any other Aurelia had ever witnessed. Clara, initially a bundle of nerves, soon found herself acting as a bridge across a chasm of grief and misunderstanding. She translated as Lily with unburdened enthusiasm, told her father about a dream she'd had, about a funny thing the cat did that morning, about how she missed the sound of her mother's violin. Not the sound itself, but the way the vibrations felt through the floorboards. Alistair listened, utterly captivated. He learned more about his daughter's inner life in that single hour than in the 4 years since his wife's death. He learned she wasn't a sad, broken thing. She was a clever, funny, observant child trapped in a well-meaning prison of silence. And he found himself watching Clara. He saw the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she conveyed the subtle nuances of Lily's signing, the passion that lit up her face as she explained a specific sign's origin, the quiet, unshakable dignity that radiated from her. She wasn't intimidated by his power or his wealth. In this moment, she held all the cards because she spoke the only language that mattered. As the evening concluded, Alistair knew that a simple job offer was insufficient. This wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a life to be rebuilt. His and Lily's. "Ms. McCallum, Clara," he began, leaning forward, his intensity pinning her to her seat. "I have a proposition. It is unorthodox, and it would require a significant change to your life." Clara's mind raced. She thought of her parents, of her precarious finances, of the little girl beside her whose eyes were finally shining. "What kind of proposition, Mr. Finch?" "I want you to move into my home. I want you to be Lily's full-time companion, interpreter, and tutor. I want you to immerse her in the language that is rightfully hers. I want you to teach me," he said, the admission costing him a visible effort. "I want you to bridge the silence in my house." He paused, letting the magnitude of the offer sink in. "I will pay you $250,000 a year, and I will cover all of your family's living and medical expenses, whatever they need." Clara's breath hitched. The number was so vast, so utterly life-altering, she could barely process it. It wasn't a salary, it was a rescue. It was freedom from worry for her parents. It was a future she had never dared to imagine. Before she could form a reply, Lily turned to her, her small hands moving with desperate urgency. "Please say yes," she signed, her eyes wide and pleading. "Please be my voice." Looking at the hopeful face of the lonely child and thinking of the secure future she could provide for her parents, Clara knew there was only one possible answer. Her life, a predictable hand-to-mouth struggle just hours ago, had been irrevocably and terrifyingly upended. "Yes," she said, her voice a near whisper. "Yes, I'll do it." The following morning, Clara's world shifted on its axis. A sleek black town car, silent as a phantom, arrived outside her weathered brick apartment building. The driver, a kind-faced man named George, called her Ms. McCallum and opened the door as if she were royalty. The drive took her from the familiar, gritty streets of Logan Square to the opulent, tree-lined grandeur of Lincoln Park, where Alistair Finch's home, a formidable graystone mansion that consumed half a city block, stood like a private fortress. As she stepped into the cavernous marble foyer, she was met by a woman with a severe gray bun and an expression of chilly disapproval. "I am Mrs. Gable, the household manager," the woman announced, her gaze sweeping over Clara's simple jeans and worn leather jacket with disdain. "Mr. Finch is in his office. Lily is in the solarium. I trust you will be discreet." The mansion was breathtakingly beautiful, but profoundly sterile. It felt less like a home and more like a museum curated by a ghost. Sunlight streamed through massive windows, illuminating priceless art in polished, empty surfaces. It was a gilded cage, and Clara felt a sudden, sharp pang of understanding for the little girl trapped within it. She found Lily in a vast, glass-walled room overflowing with exotic plants, a stark contrast to the rest of the home's muted tones. It had clearly been her mother's sanctuary. Lily was curled on a window seat, sketching in a large notepad. When she saw Clara, her face broke into a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "You came," she signed, scrambling off the seat and running to her. "I was scared it was a dream." "I'm here," Clara signed back, her heart swelling. "And I'm very real." Now what are you drawing? Lily proudly showed her the sketch pad. It was filled with intricate, fantastical drawings of flowers with faces and animals with wings. A vibrant, imaginative world poured onto the page, a world she had no one to share it with. This, Clara realized, was how she spoke when her hands were not enough. Their first day was a gentle exploration. Clara didn't push or pry. She simply existed in Lily's space, speaking her language. They toured the silent house, with Clara giving ASL names to the stoic portraits on the walls. They explored the garden, where Lily showed her the spot where the red kisses used to grow. For the first time, Lily wasn't being managed or therapized. She was simply being a child with a friend. While they were in the garden, Garrison Thorne made an unannounced visit. He emerged onto the stone terrace, his smile as bright and cold as the afternoon sun. He greeted Lily with an airy kiss to the top of her head before turning his full, assessing gaze on Clara. "So, you're the miracle worker," he said, his voice a silken purr with an undercurrent of steel. "Alistair is uncharacteristically optimistic." "I'm just here to help Lily," Clara replied, her tone polite but guarded. "Of course," Garrison said, his eyes roaming over her, taking in every detail. "It's a remarkable story. Waitress from the other side of the tracks, a hidden talent. It's like something out of a movie. You must feel like you've won the lottery." The words were ostensibly a compliment, but the insinuation was clear. He saw her as an opportunist, a clever grifter who had stumbled upon the score of a lifetime. He lingered for an hour, a scrutinizing presence. He watched the easy, natural rapport between Clara and his niece, the way Lily's entire demeanor changed in Clara's presence. He saw the genuine affection already taking root, and a flicker of something dark and cold passed through his eyes. For 4 years, Lily's deafness and Alistair's grief had been his greatest assets. They created a power vacuum he was happy to fill, managing Lily's trust, a fortune in its own right, with unchecked authority. A communicative, empowered Lily, with a fierce advocate like Clara by her side, was a threat to his carefully constructed empire. That evening, Garrison found Alistair in his study. "She certainly got the child mesmerized," he began casually, pouring himself a brandy from a crystal decanter. "Clara is qualified and professional," Alistair corrected, his eyes on a stack of documents. "Oh, I have no doubt," Garrison purred. "But isn't this all a bit sudden? You pull this girl from obscurity, install her in your home, give her complete access to your daughter. We know nothing about her, Alistair. What if this is a setup? A woman with that specific, rare skill just happens to be serving your table on the one night you bring Lily out. The coincidence is staggering." "It was a fortunate coincidence," Alistair said, his voice firm, though Garrison's words pricked at his natural suspicion. "Was it?" Garrison countered, leaning against the mahogany desk. "Or was it reconnaissance? A sob story about her parents? A desperate situation? It's the oldest play in the book. I'm just saying, be cautious. You've brought a stray into the heart of our family. Strays can be unpredictable. Sometimes they bite." Alistair's gaze remained on his papers. "My daughter smiled today, Garrison. A real smile. That's all the due diligence I need." But as his brother-in-law left, a seed of doubt had been expertly planted. Alistair was a man who trusted data, who mitigated risk, who anticipated betrayal. He had made this decision from the gut, an organ he distrusted implicitly. Garrison's words, slick and venomous, resonated with the cynical core of his being. Was Clara McCallum truly a godsend? Or was she merely the most sophisticated trap he had ever encountered? He tried to dismiss the thought, but it lingered. A dark shadow coiled in the corner of his mind. The weeks that followed were a period of tentative, fragile growth within the stone walls of the Finch mansion. Clara's presence was like rain on a dormant landscape, coaxing life from the parched earth of their silent world. Her bond with Lily solidified into something fierce and beautiful. They were no longer just tutor and student. They were allies, confidants, a two-person tribe in a house full of echoes. Clara discovered the depths of Lily's intelligence. The child wasn't just artistic, she was whip-smart, with a keen, logical mind that had been starved of stimulation. Clara introduced her to sign stories, to the history of deaf culture, to the poetry of ASL. She taught her that her deafness was not a deficiency, but an identity, a vibrant culture with its own language and heritage. Lily absorbed it all, her personality blooming in the sudden light of understanding. At the same time, Alistair began his own lessons. Every evening after Lily was in bed, he would sit with Clara in the vast library, the space between them charged with a strange mix of professional distance and burgeoning intimacy. The lessons were a humbling experience for him. The master of the universe in the boardroom became a clumsy, fumbling student. His large, capable hands, so adept at signing billion-dollar contracts, struggled to form the delicate, nuanced shapes of the language. "No, your thumb should be tucked in for the letter A," Clara would correct gently, her fingers briefly touching his to adjust his hand. The fleeting contact sent a jolt through him, an unexpected warmth that was both unsettling and pleasant. Through these lessons, he began to see the woman behind the interpreter. He learned about her parents, not as a sob story, but as proud, resilient people who had built a loving home against the odds. She showed him photos of their small, cluttered house filled with books and art, and a video of her father, a retired carpenter, telling a long, hilarious signed story that had her weeping with laughter. He saw her fierce loyalty, her quiet strength, and the deep well of kindness that seemed to be the very core of her being. His admiration grew, but so did the insidious whisper of Garrison's doubt. He couldn't reconcile the warm, genuine woman who treated his daughter with such profound tenderness with the calculating opportunist his brother-in-law described. He tasked his security team with a background check, telling himself it was standard procedure. The report came back clean but detailed. It outlined her precarious finances, a small student loan she was struggling to pay, and the fact that her parents' aging home was in desperate need of repairs they couldn't afford. The facts were neutral, but through the lens of suspicion, they formed a powerful motive. One afternoon, Garrison arrived with a stack of documents from Lily's trust. "Just the quarterly reports for you to sign off on, Alistair," he said smoothly, spreading them on the library table where Clara and Lily were reading. Lily, now more confident, looked up. With Clara's encouragement, she was beginning to take an interest in the things that were hers. "What is that?" she signed to Clara. "It's paperwork about your trust fund, sweetheart," Clara explained. "The money your mother left for you." She glanced at the top sheet, a summary of philanthropic disbursements. She noticed a line item, the Ellington Academy for Youth Music. She remembered Alistair mentioning it was his late wife's beloved alma mater, a place she had supported passionately. "The Ellington donation seems lower this quarter," Clara observed aloud, more out of idle curiosity than suspicion. Garrison's smile didn't flicker, but his eyes went cold for a fraction of a second. Budgetary reallocations. We're funneling more into a high-yield tech portfolio for Lily's long-term growth, much more efficient than sentimental donations. He turned to Lily and gave her a condescending pat. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about it. Uncle Garrison is making your money grow." Lily recoiled from his touch and signed sharply to Clara. "Mommy loved that school. She said music was for everyone, even for people who feel it instead of hear it." When Clara translated, a shadow passed over Alistair's face. His wife's last project had been to fund a program at Ellington for haptic instruments designed for deaf and hard-of-hearing students. "Garrison," Alistair said, his voice quiet, "let's ensure we restore the funding to its previous levels. It's what she would have wanted." "Of course, Alistair. Whatever you say," Garrison agreed easily, but he shot a look at Clara, a flash of pure, unadulterated venom. It was gone in an instant, but Clara saw it. In his mind, she wasn't just an interpreter. She was an interloper, giving his niece a voice, and with it, a power he could not control. That night, a private investigator hired by Garrison delivered a thick file to his office. It was a masterpiece of twisted truths. It contained photos of her parents' modest, slightly dilapidated home, framed as a sign of neglect. It included copies of her loan agreements, highlighted and annotated to look like a mountain of reckless debt. Most damningly, it contained a heavily edited transcript of an interview with a disgruntled former employee from Aurelia who claimed Clara had been obsessed with the restaurant's wealthy clientele and had specifically researched Alistair Finch before he came in that night. It was a lie, but it was a plausible one. Garrison smiled, a thin, predatory expression. He had the weapon he needed. He picked up the phone. "Alistair," he said, his voice grave with manufactured concern. "I have something you need to see. It's about Ms. McCallum. I'm afraid my initial concerns were more valid than I ever imagined." The confrontation, when it came, was not a storm, but a sudden, brutal ice age. Alistair summoned Clara to his study late that night. The room, usually a warm, inviting space of leather and wood, felt like a courtroom. He wasn't sitting behind his desk. He was standing by the cold fireplace, his back to her, staring into the empty grate. The thick file Garrison had given him lay open on the mantelpiece. "I've been a fool," he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. It was the voice he used for hostile takeovers, a flat, metallic instrument of destruction. Clara's heart began to pound. "Alistair, what's wrong?" He turned, and the man she had been getting to know, the grieving husband, the fumbling father, the tentative student, was gone. In his place stood the ruthless titan of finance, his eyes frozen over with suspicion and betrayal. "How much of it was real?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Any of it? Or was it all part of the long con? The lonely girl, the deaf parents, the perfectly timed intervention? It was a brilliant strategy. I'll give you that." He gestured to the file on the mantel. "I have it all here. Your debt, your research into my family, the convenient coincidence of your employment at Aurelia. You played on my daughter's disability. You exploited my grief. You saw a grieving billionaire with a vulnerable child, and you saw a jackpot." Every word was a physical blow. He was twisting her life, her identity, her deepest loves into something sordid and manipulative. "That's not true," she whispered, her voice shaking. "That's a lie." "Is it?" he sneered, picking up a photograph from the file, a picture of her parents' home. "Is it a lie that your family is desperate for money, that you saw a way out and took it? You manipulated a lonely little girl and a guilty father. Tell me, Clara, what was the end game? A permanent position in the family? Marriage? Were you hoping to sign your way into an inheritance?" The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He had taken every moment of genuine connection, every shared vulnerability, and weaponized it against her. Tears of rage and profound hurt burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. She lifted her chin, her own gaze hardening. "You know what your problem is, Alistair. You live in a world of transactions. You think everything and everyone has a price tag. You can't conceive of an act of simple human kindness because it doesn't fit on a balance sheet. You see shadows and threats everywhere because you've forgotten what light looks like." She walked toward him, her movements filled with a cold, righteous fury. "You want to talk about lies? Let's talk about lies. You want to see a con artist? Look at your brother-in-law." Alistair scoffed. "Leave Garrison out of this." "I won't," she shot back, her voice gaining strength. "He's the one who fed you this poison." "Why?" "Because I gave Lily a voice, and a voiced Lily might start asking questions. Questions like why the funding for her mother's favorite charity, the Ellington Academy, was suddenly cut. You should look at the actual bank transfers, Alistair, not just the summaries he shows you. See where that money really went." She stopped in front of him, her eyes boring into his. "You think I did this for money? After all this time, that's who you think I am?" With trembling fingers, she unclasped a day she did not run. To run would have been a concession, an admission of flight from a place where she had never truly belonged. Instead, Clara walked. Each step down the long, crushed gravel driveway was a deliberate act of severance, a percussive beat marking the end of a chapter she had been foolish enough to believe was a fairy tale. The night air, cool and damp against her burning cheeks, carried the scent of manicured boxwoods and old money, a fragrance that now seemed cloying, suffocating. She didn't look back at the Greystone fortress, at the single golden rectangle of light that was Alistair's study. To look back would be to acknowledge the ghost of the life she had almost had, the family she had almost formed, and she did not have the strength for that. The cage, he had called it. He was wrong. The mansion wasn't the cage. The cage was his suspicion. It was the gilded bars of his worldview, where every motive was suspect, every kindness a transaction, every person a potential threat to be neutralized. She had been a curiosity, then a tool, then a liability. She had unlocked his daughter only to find herself locked out of his heart. The pain was a physical thing, a shard of ice lodged beneath her sternum. It wasn't just the loss of a job, or even the loss of a future she hadn't dared to dream of. It was the brutal, violent erasure of her character, the negation of her very self by the one man who, for a few impossible weeks, she had allowed herself to see. By the time she reached the ornate wrought iron gates, her righteous fury had cooled, leaving behind the hollow, echoing ache of grief. She didn't call a car. She walked block after silent, tree-lined block until the grandeur of Lincoln Park bled into the familiar, vibrant grit of her own neighborhood. The city lights, which from Alistair's penthouse restaurant had looked like a scattered handful of diamonds, were now just street lamps, casting a jaundiced, lonely glow on the pavement. She was back in her world, a world of cracked sidewalks and the distant wail of sirens. A world where silence was not a luxury, but a language of love and community. It was a world she had almost been able to save her parents from. The thought of their faces, of the hope she had kindled in them, was the final, devastating blow. She stumbled into her small apartment, the silence within its walls a stark, pathetic contrast to the profound, living silence she had left behind, and finally she allowed herself to break. Inside the study, the silence Alistair had cultivated for years returned with a vengeance. It was no longer a shield but a mirror, reflecting the vast emptiness of his life. The gold bracelet in his hand was heavy, its delicate links a chain of accusations. Her parting words about Garrison and the Ellington Academy circled him like vultures. Look at the actual bank transfers, Alistair. Not just the summaries he shows you. It was a detail too sharp, too specific to be a random barb. It was a key. He spent the rest of the night in a state of cold, controlled dread. He didn't sleep. He sat at his mahogany desk, the epicenter of his global empire, and felt utterly powerless. He was a man who commanded legions of analysts to predict market fluctuations and mitigate risk. Yet he had failed to see the viper coiled in his own family, the wolf he had invited to guard the flock. The first casualty of his catastrophic misjudgment was Lily. When she padded into his study the next morning, her bright, expectant face was a fresh torment. She looked around, her eyes searching. "Clara?" She signed, a simple, hopeful question that landed like a punch to the gut. He tried to explain, his hands moving with a clumsy, arthritic slowness that felt like a mockery of the language. Clara. Job. Done. Gone. He watched the light in his daughter's eyes die. It was not a flicker. It was an extinguishment. The vibrant, confident child who had blossomed over the past weeks vanished, replaced by the familiar, shuttered porcelain doll. But this time, her expression was not one of vacant resignation. It was one of pure, 8-year-old fury. She stared at him, her small body rigid with betrayal. Then she turned, marched to his desk, and seized a black fountain pen. On a sheet of his heavy, cream-colored stationery, she scrawled a single, devastating sentence in thick, angry capitals. "You are the silence now." She slid the paper across the polished wood toward him and walked out, not to her room, but to the solarium, her mother's sanctuary, shutting the heavy glass doors behind her with a definitive click. The message was clear. She had not retreated into herself. She had exiled him. The words on the page seemed to burn. He had spent 4 years trying to fight the silence, to fill it with sound and technology. Now he had become it. He was the void. He was the wall. At precisely 7 a.m., his phone buzzed. It was Marcus Thorne, no relation to Garrison, the notoriously meticulous head of his family office's forensic accounting division. Alistair had roused him from his bed at 3 a.m. with a single, non-negotiable directive. A full, unredacted audit of the Lily Finch Trust, effective immediately. "Alistair," Marcus's voice was grim, stripped of its usual professional deference. "It's bad. It's worse than you can imagine." He used a cascading shell corporation structure, registered in 3 different no-extradition territories. The Ellington transfer was the key. He's been bleeding the philanthropic accounts dry for at least 3 years, maybe longer. We're talking millions. He was washing the money through undervalued art acquisitions and then flipping them at auction in Geneva. It's sophisticated, and it's deeply predatory. He specifically targeted your late wife's legacy projects, the ones he knew you wouldn't have the stomach to scrutinize closely. Alistair closed his eyes. Each word was a nail being hammered into a coffin. The genius of Garrison's manipulation had been its parasitic nature. He had fed on Alistair's grief, on his guilt, on his cynical, transactional view of the world. He had seen Alistair's suspicion not as a barrier, but as a weapon he could aim. The file he had produced on Clara, it was all there. A masterpiece of plausible lies woven from half-truths. Her parents' financial struggles, her student debt, the disgruntled ex-employee. Garrison had simply provided the narrative, a narrative Alistair had been preconditioned to believe. He hadn't just been duped. He had been an active, willing participant in his own deception. He hung up the phone. The house was utterly still. In the silence, he could hear the echo of Clara's voice, filled with a hurt so profound it had transcended tears. You can't conceive of an act of simple human kindness because it doesn't fit on a balance sheet. He had taken the purest, most selfless thing to enter his life since his wife's death and subjected it to a hostile audit. And he, the master analyst, had gotten the valuation catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. Weeks passed. The legal and financial fallout with Garrison was swift and brutal. Alistair moved with a chilling, surgical precision, dismantling his brother-in-law's life and liberty with the same dispassionate efficiency he applied to a corporate restructuring. There were no emotional confrontations, no shouted accusations, just the cold, quiet machinery of justice and consequence. Garrison was a liability, and Alistair expunged him, but the victory was hollow, a ghost of a triumph that offered no solace. His relationship with Lily remained a frozen wasteland. She communicated with him only through terse, formal notes left on the kitchen island. She ate her meals in the solarium. The bridge Clara had built between them was gone, and the chasm seemed wider and deeper than ever before. He hired a new ASL tutor, the best in the country, a stern academic woman from Gallaudet University. He dedicated himself to the lessons with a grim, relentless focus. But the language wouldn't come. His hands felt like clumsy clubs. His mind, so adept at complex financial models, could not grasp the fluid poetry of the signs. It felt like a penance, every fumbled word a reminder of his failure. One evening, his tutor, Dr. Eris, paused the lesson. "Mr. Finch," she said, her expression analytical, "you are memorizing vocabulary. You are not learning a language. A language requires an ear, a willingness to listen. You are still trying to command it." Her words struck him. He had been approaching it like a negotiation, trying to force the terms of surrender. He hadn't been listening. He hadn't been listening for years. Meanwhile, Clara was rebuilding. The first week had been a blur of shame and heartbreak. But her parents, seeing her pain, had not offered pity. They had offered strength. Her father had taken her hand, his own calloused and strong from a lifetime of carpentry, and signed, "Sometimes a house must be stripped to the studs before you can see the strength of its frame. You have a strong frame, my girl." She found a new purpose. Not at a restaurant, but at a small, underfunded deaf community center in Pilsen. She volunteered, then was offered a part-time job, teaching ASL to hearing parents of deaf children, tutoring kids who were falling behind in school, translating for community meetings. The pay was a pittance, but the work was rich. Here, in the vibrant, noisy silence of her own community, she began to heal. She was surrounded by the language that was her birthright, by people who saw her not as a curiosity or an asset, but as one of their own. She was not Ms. McCallum, the miracle worker from the restaurant. She was just Clara, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough. She thought of Alistair and Lily, of course. The thoughts were unbidden, sharp pangs of memory that would surface when she saw a little girl with blonde hair or a man in a perfectly tailored suit. She hoped Lily was okay. She hoped Alistair had found someone else. She told herself it was better this way. Their worlds were never meant to intersect, only to collide. One Saturday afternoon, she was in the community center's main room, leading a circle of small children in a signed story about a mischievous bear. The room was filled with the silent music of their moving hands and the occasional peal of laughter. She was so absorbed in the story, her face animated, her hands painting pictures in the air, that she didn't notice the man standing hesitantly in the doorway. He was not the man she remembered. The bespoke suit was gone, replaced by a simple dark sweater and jeans. The aura of untouchable power had been replaced by a visible, palpable uncertainty. He looked like an intruder, an alien in this world of expressive, silent communication. He was holding a children's picture book. Alistair Finch stood there for a long time, just watching. He watched Clara, truly saw her, not as an employee or a solution, but as a sun in her own solar system. He saw the way the children's faces lit up as she signed, the way she moved with an innate grace and authority that had nothing to do with wealth. She was the center of this universe, and he was a foreigner at the border with no passport and no language. Finally, one of the children noticed him and tugged on Clara's sleeve, pointing. Clara's hands froze midair. Her smile faltered. The air in the room shifted. All the children turned to stare at the tall, quiet-hearing man in the doorway. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt 100 emotions at once: anger, hurt, a foolish, treacherous flutter of hope. She took a deep breath, composed herself, and signed to the children. "Wait here." She walked towards him, her expression a careful, neutral mask. She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms, a defensive posture. He didn't speak. He knew instinctively that spoken words were meaningless here. They were his language, his weapon, his crutch. To use them would be another act of colonization. He swallowed hard, his nervousness so profound it was almost visible. Then he lifted his hands. They were still clumsy, the movement stiff and uncertain, but they moved. "Hello? Clara?" he signed. His execution was flawed, the sign for her name a little shaky. She just stared, her face unreadable. He took a shaky breath and continued, his eyes fixed on hers, a desperate plea for her to understand, to listen with more grace than he had ever shown her. "My daughter, Lily, she, Mrs. You." He paused, his brow furrowed in concentration. "She gave me a test, a task." He held up the picture book. It was the runaway bunny. She said, "I cannot talk to you until I learn the whole story to tell her." He looked down at his fumbling hands, then back up at her, his composure cracking, the raw vulnerability of a broken man laid bare. "I have practiced for weeks. I am not good, but I am here to try." Clara's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. This was not a power play. This was not a grand, empty gesture. This was penance. This was work. This was a man who had commanded boardrooms and leveled corporations, humbling himself to learn a children's story in a foreign language. Not to win her back, but simply to earn the right to speak to her at all. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the encouragement he needed. He began. Standing in the middle of the crowded community center, surrounded by the silent, curious stares of her people, Alistair Finch told the story of the runaway bunny. His hands stumbled. He mixed up the sign for boat with the sign for cloud. He had to stop and restart the passage about the bunny becoming a fish in a trout stream. He was sweating, his face pale with exertion. Clara watched mesmerized. She wasn't watching a billionaire. She was watching a father, desperately trying to build a bridge back to his child, brick by agonizing brick. She saw the weeks of lonely, frustrating practice behind every flawed sign, and in his struggle, she saw something she had never seen in him before: true, profound humility. When he finally finished, his hands dropped to his sides, exhausted. The room was silent. Then one of the small children, a little boy with bright, curious eyes, began to clap, not by making noise, but in the deaf way. by raising his hands and twisting his wrists. Soon all the children were doing it. A silent, shimmering ovation for the clumsy, earnest hearing man. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, blurring the image of Alistair's exhausted, hopeful face. She walked him outside into the small concrete courtyard behind the building. The sounds of the city felt distant. "The foundation is real," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "The Lily Finch Foundation for Deaf Arts and Education. I've endowed it. Its first act was to settle your parents' mortgage and establish an annuity for them. They will never have to worry about money again." Clara flinched. "Alistair, I told you." "It's not for you," he interrupted gently. "It's for them. It's restitution. It doesn't absolve me of anything." He looked at her, his gaze direct and stripped of all artifice. "The foundation has a board. It has a mission statement. It has an endowment of $50 million. But it has no soul. It has no director. Because the only person on earth qualified to run it, the only person with the integrity, the passion, and the heart to make it mean something, is you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the delicate gold bracelet. It gleamed in the afternoon sun. "This was a transaction," he said, his voice thick with shame. "It was a gift from a man who thought he could buy affection, who saw you as an asset to his life. I want to give it back to you, not as a transaction, but as a promise." He held it out, not to her wrist, but on his open palm. "A promise to listen, a promise to keep learning, a promise to build things, not buy them, a promise to be a man worthy of my daughter's love and your respect." The world seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't an apology, it was a metamorphosis. He hadn't just learned a few signs, he had begun to learn a new way of being. He had walked out of his fortress and into the world, seeking not to conquer it, but to understand it. Slowly, Clara reached out. She didn't take the bracelet. Instead, she gently closed his fingers over it. "Keep it," she said softly, "until you've learned the whole book by heart." A slow smile spread across Alistair's face, a genuine expression of relief and dawning joy that reached his tired eyes. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. It was something far more valuable. It was a beginning. She looked at the bustling community center behind her, at the world she had reclaimed. Then she looked at the man before her, a man who had shattered her world and was now painstakingly trying to help her build a new, better one. She lifted her hands, the movements now fluid, clear, and filled with a light he had been terrified he would never see again. "Okay, Alistair," she signed. "Let's begin."